Hi everybody, welcome to Saxon's Hydrosphere. I'm Saxon and I love music and I love movies, and with this channel I wanted to create a space where both music and movie lovers can coexist. And today I'm going to be ranking Iron Maiden's full discography from the worst to the best. So Iron Maiden are one of the biggest names in heavy metal, started in the late 70s and have consistently released albums since then until this very day. They released their last album last year, I think. Their input has slowed down over the past 10 to 15 years or so, but they have been a band with very consistent releases throughout their entire career. Of course, they've had a number of lineup changes over the years, but that is to be expected with a band that has lasted as long as they have. And I wanted to make this video because they were one of my favourite bands growing up as I was getting into the metal genre, and I think they're an interesting band to talk about because they have a wide range of quality in their output. And of course this goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, and this is just my opinion, dude, so if you disagree with me, let me know in the comments and give me your Iron Maiden ranking too. Without further ado, let's get into it. At the very bottom, number 17, which is unfortunately their newest album, Senjutsu. Listen, I've really tried with this album, if you can count 2 attempts, really trying, but I just have no desire to go back to this one. It really does nothing for me. It feels way too drawn out, really uninspired. There's a lot of rinse and repeat going on throughout this record. The production isn't great, it sounds really murky and horrible, and they just feel like they've got training wheels on throughout a lot of this album. And I know you were probably expecting the 2 Blaze Bayley albums at the bottom, but for me what makes this even worse than those 2 albums is that it's an hour and 20 minutes long of just nothing. It's double the length of those albums, near enough, and it's just such an exhausting listen with very little in the way of quality and memorability at all. Number 16, and we are getting into the Blaze Bayley albums now. I'm going to start this off with Virtual 11. There's just very little in quality on this album. There's 1 or 2 good songs, but also 1 or 2 incredibly awful songs, some of the worst in Iron Maiden's career. Angel and the Gambler just goes on and on and on and on and on, and it's exhausting. Future Real is okay and has potential to be a great song had it been handled by a different singer, which I think the same can be said for most of the songs on these 2 albums. But yeah, it's well known that this album just doesn't do much for many people at all. Getting into number 15 now, which is of course the X Factor. A lot of similar issues to Virtual 11 with the production, the performance from Blaze Bayley, a lot of forgettable songs, but this one is elevated ever so slightly with tracks like Sign of the Cross and Lord of the Flies. There's just a couple of better moments on this album overall as opposed to Virtual 11. But not much more I can say about it really. Like I said, it's very similar to Virtual 11 in the sense that it's quite forgettable in a lot of areas and just very weak in terms of performance and production. Number 14, I'm going with No Prayer for the Dying, and with similar issues as the last 3 albums mentioned is that there's just quite a lot that's forgettable on this album. And I also really don't understand how Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter was a #1 single, because I really don't think that song is that special at all. And then you've also got songs like Mother Russia that feel quite goofy in areas, and just a lot of the performances, Bruce Dickinson especially, is getting a bit raspy in his vocal delivery on this album, and it's just not amazing. And the production is very lackluster too. There's a few good songs, but overall it's just not a very enjoyable album from start to finish. For number 13, I'm going with The Book of Souls. This was the band's first double album, and it really feels like it. It's way too long, and I feel like a lot of these songs were overly extensive just so they could say, we've got songs that are longer than the Ram of the Ancient Mariner now. A lot of it just feels way too overblown and self-indulgent in a way that doesn't serve these songs at all. There are a few good songs on here. I thought Speed of Light was a cool single when it came out, but overall it's just very self-indulgent and not a lot of substance in here. Number 12 now, and this will conclude the few albums that overall don't do a lot for me, and that is Fear of the Dark. The title track I know is a classic, and I still do get a kick out of listening to that song, and there are a few other good songs in here like Be Quick or Be Dead, Afraid to Shoot Strangers, Wasting Love is cool, Weekend Warrior. Judas Be My Guide has a great chorus as well, but again, the rest of the album feels very, very drawn out. It feels longer than it is, and most of the other songs feel incredibly fillery. It was a huge step up though from No Prayer of the Dying in terms of the production and the performances and the atmosphere as a whole. This album really does feel like it has a theme to it, unlike No Prayer for the Dying, but again, like I said, it's just quite fillery in places, and it's not one that I go to too often to put in because as a start to end listening experience, it's just not that fun. Number 11, I'm going with their self-titled debut album, Iron Maiden. I think Paul Di'Anno really suited the band's style that they had back in these early days with these first 2 albums, and I still do enjoy listening to a lot of these classic songs like Prowler and Running Free, and Phantom of the Opera is again another huge classic. The only reason it doesn't really get too much higher for me is because there are still a couple of duds in there like Charlotte the Harlot, and it feels like the band was still trying to kind of find their feet a little bit, and I just prefer the other 10 albums on this list a lot better to this one. And next up we have the album that followed their debut, Killers. This tends to be quite a divisive album from what I can see. A lot of people have it quite low, a lot of people have it quite high, and again it varies varies whether it's ahead of the debut or below it, but I think it is slightly better than the debut. I think the good songs that are in this album stand way above the songs on the debut and are a lot more memorable, have a lot more of a distinct feel to them. Wrathchild is great. I really love Murders in the Rue Morgue. There's also The Prodigal Son and Purgatory. The title track is always a fun one. But for me, as great as those songs are that are better than the debut, there are also more fillery kind of songs on this album than the debut, which is why Killers doesn't reach higher lengths for me. Number 9, I'm going with A Matter of Life and Death. I really enjoy listening to this album when I have it on, but afterwards there's not much that sticks in my head, and there aren't many songs that I'll go to listen to on their own. This is one that, again, I feel is a little bit fillery in places, but songs like Different World, Brighter Than a Thousand Suns, The Pilgrim are all fantastic, and I love these songs. And this record does have a very unique style to it. I think if you were to listen to a song from this album, you'd be able to recognize it from A Matter of Life and Death instantly. But what keeps this one a little bit lower for me is the listening experience from start to finish. It just doesn't grip me all the way through. And I feel like I'm repeating myself now when I mention fillery, but that's quite a common theme with the middle of the road Iron Maiden albums. There's just a lot of fillery tracks here and there, which stops them from being the great albums. Number 8, I'm going with The Final Frontier. This was actually one of the first albums I heard from Iron Maiden because I got into the band around 2010, I think, just after this album had came out, and I got to see them live on this tour, which was fantastic as well. The live show was amazing. It's the only time I've ever seen Maiden live, but I did have a great time. But I really enjoy this album, and I feel like it can be quite underrated at times. There are some great hidden gems on here, like The Talisman, Starblind, Isle of Avalon, El Dorado is fun. I really enjoy Coming Home and the 2 longer songs that close the album off. I do wish that the intro to The Final Frontier wasn't so long and drawn out. I remember when I had this album on my iPod, I just skipped forward like 4 minutes, but you can't do that when you put the disc in, really. It's just a little nitpick, really, because it's just a few minutes of space noise, but it does set the tone for the entire album as a whole. And like I said, I think this is a really underrated album. I think it's produced incredibly well for a modern Maiden album. I feel like everything after this, saying that, they've only had 2 albums after The Final Frontier. Anyway, both Book of Souls and Senjutsu don't hold a candle to the production on The Final Frontier. I do feel like the pacing struggles here and there because this is in the Iron Maiden era where a lot of songs have to have the clean opening that builds and builds and builds, which can get old, which is one of my biggest problems on Senjutsu. But apart from that little pacing issue, I think it's an incredibly tight album and just a great listen. I've not listened to this album in a long time actually, and I think I might do it after recording this video. Number 7, and we're getting into the classics now, the creme de la creme, and I'm going to kick that off with Peace of Mind. This album for me has always felt like the weakest of the 80s output, just because the second side of the album doesn't really compare to the first side, with songs like To Tame a Land, Sun and Steel, Quest for Fire. Just doesn't really compare to Flight of Icarus, Die With Your Boots On, Where Eagles Dare, Revelations. And The Trooper is of course a classic, definitely one of their more well-known and popular songs. But what keeps this from top 5 material for me is, like I said, the B-side. It just loses a lot of steam for me in the second half. Number 6, and getting into the great Iron Maiden albums now with The Number of the Beast. This was the first album to feature Bruce Dickinson on vocals, and I weren't around at this time, but I feel like this was the album that really blew up the band. So many classics and live staples and popular songs amongst the fan base from this album, with the title track, Hallowed Be Thy Name, Run to the Hills. And I think what's interesting and unique about this album is that the first half of the album doesn't have any of the classics on it, but they are still amazing songs like Invaders, Children of the Damned. The Prisoner is one of my favourite Iron Maiden songs. I love that tune. The only reason this isn't as high as the others is just I really prefer the others a lot more. I don't seem to come back to this one as much as maybe I should, but it's still a great album. I don't think there's a bad song on The Number of the Beast either. It's a classic, definitely one of their best. Number 5, A Brave New World. This was the album that kicked off the modern era of Maiden albums when they brought Bruce Dickinson back into the band, and they really hit the ground running again with this album. So many memorable songs, huge choruses, a lot of emotional performances with songs like The Thin Line Between Love and Hate, Blood Brothers, A Brave New World. I think the guitar tones are really unique and special to this album. There's a lot of very watery and creamy feeling lead tones on the album. The only thing that keeps this album from being the best of the modern era albums for me is that when we get around the middle with songs like Dream of Mirrors and The Mercenary and The Fallen Angel, kind of loses steam a little bit for me. It loses memorability. I can't really remember what a couple of the middle songs actually sound like on this album, despite having heard the album so many times in my life. But that aside, this is a fantastic album with, like I said, a very unique style and sonic atmosphere unto itself. Number 4, probably a controversial pick, and that's going to be Dance of Death. This album gets a lot of bad rep, and I'm not really sure why. Maybe it's the god-awful artwork. But I've always been an apologist for this album. I think it's great. I distinctly remember my first time listening to this album, and I always will. I think the atmosphere and style to this album is incredibly unique unto itself. It's got a hugely theatrical feel to it. And as well as the dark and atmospheric material on here, you've got some really overzealous and optimistic sounding songs as well, like Gates of Tomorrow, New Frontier, Wildest Dreams. Rainmaker was a great song. The title track is of course fantastic. Passchendaele is great. Facing the Sand and Age of Innocence are also great. And the only thing that keeps this from being like top 3 is Monstergure and No More Lies. Apart from that, I think this album is fantastic and incredibly underrated. If you haven't listened to this album for a while and kind of dismissed it, I seriously invite you to give it another try. I think it's fantastic. I would tell you about my thoughts and feelings and how I was and where I was the first time I listened to this album, but I feel like it would only really mean something to me and might bore you a little bit. But just know that my first listening experience to this album was incredible, and it's never really lost that quality for me. I love Dance of Death. Top 3 now, and I feel like most people's lists will have these final 3 albums as their top 3, and I'm going to start this off with Power Slave. For a long time in my teenage years, this was actually my favourite album, and I would never budge from that standpoint. So many classics here, like Aces High, 2 Minutes to Midnight, the title track is fantastic, and some of the deeper cuts too, like The Duelists and Flash of the Blade were also really great. Rime of the Ancient Mariner has always been one of my favourites, and I still count it as the longest Iron Maiden song because it actually feels like it should be 13 minutes. Unlike everything that came off of Book of Souls. The only reason that this isn't number 1 is because Lost for Words loses me a little bit, Back in the Village isn't as good as it maybe could be, and I've just had a lot more of a deeper appreciation for the top 2 albums on this list over the past few years. So starting number 2 with Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. And again, for a while I considered this album to be my favourite Maiden release too, until not too long ago. I love the sound and atmosphere and feel to this album. It's really ethereal in its tones. And Iron Maiden really knew how to use keys and synths during these couple of years of their career. I don't think there's a song that I don't like on this album at all, and a lot of them are among my favourite Iron Maiden songs. Moonchild, Infinite Dreams is great. Of course, you've got The Evil That Men Do, Can I Play With Madness is another classic. The only reason that this album has fallen to number 2 for me is because the long track on this song isn't as good as the longer track on my favourite Maiden album, which is Somewhere in Time. So for me, I do think it matches the composition and songwriting abilities from Seventh Son, but the only thing that elevates Somewhere in Time for me is that Alexander the Great is a better epic than Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. And that is my only piece of criteria that pushes Somewhere in Time above Seventh Son. Because Alexander the Great feels just that little bit more cohesive, tight, and stylized as well. But I don't know what I can say about this album that hasn't already been said. This was the first album to really bring synths into the mix, and it only really lasted for 2 albums. I don't know why they didn't really keep this up through No Prayer for the Dying. I love when they use the synths on these 2 albums. It creates such a unique feel and atmosphere to these 2 albums. Whenever we get to songs like Sea of Madness, Heaven Can Wait, Stranger in a Strange Land, The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner was a favourite of mine for years when I was first getting into the band. I loved this song, and I still do. Every song is perfect. I don't think there's a moment where this album loses steam for me, which has been a common theme for a lot of Maiden's 90s and onwards albums. I just really think they captured magic with this one, and I always enjoy coming back to it, and it is one of my favourite albums of all time as well. Oh god, I need to sneeze. Excuse me. And that was it for my Iron Maiden discography ranking. Let me know what your favourite Maiden albums are down below in the comments. Remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. I also do have a Patreon, which would be really cool to have more people involved in, so I'd be very grateful if you were to perhaps check that out. I'm going to leave you with my song of the day now, which, just like in my other discography reviews, I've left to be my favourite song from this band, which I deliberately left out when I was talking about the album because I wanted to save it for my song of the day, and that is Deja Vu. I feel like it's a very underrated and glossed over song from Somewhere in Time, but it's always been one of my favourites. There's such a clear, mysterious feel to it. The chorus is huge, the guitar melodies are great, the solo's amazing. Great song that I feel gets a little bit overlooked. So yeah, Deja Vu is my song of the day. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you in the next one.